Hey everyone, let's jump into the Wayback Machine today for a deep dive into the 486 era.
Yeah, I love this era.
Not just the tech itself, but the whole vibe of early PC gaming.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of what we take for granted today started back then, right?
Absolutely. And the book we're looking at, Revolutionizing the 486, Nostalgic Tales from the Dawn of Modern Gaming, really captures that feeling of like being on the cutting edge.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not just some dry history book. It's written by someone who actually lived through this. So we get those personal stories.
Yeah.
Like what it was really like to be there.
Yeah, for sure. Like right off the bat, the author talks about getting their hands on a 486 processor for the first time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like, oh, this is a cool upgrade. It was like, this unlocks a whole new world.
Okay, so for those of us who weren't building PCs back then, break it down for us. What made the 486 such a game changer?
Okay, so think of it this way. Processing power. That's like the brain power of your computer, right? The 486 was a huge jump forward in that area. So suddenly you could do more complex calculations, handle data faster, smoother graphics, more detailed game worlds. You could create things that just weren't possible before.
Like Wolfenstein 3D Doom. Right. I mean, those were mind-blowing back in the day.
Exactly. Those games wouldn't have been possible without that extra processing power.
Because
of the 3D environments. I mean, that was a huge deal back then. Going from mostly 2D games to suddenly you're like in the three-dimensional world.
Yeah, that's hard to even imagine now.
Right.
We're so used to these crazy realistic graphics.
Totally. And it wasn't just the visuals either. The 486 also made it possible to do more with sound. Remember those early Sound Blaster cards?
Vaguely,
Yeah.
yeah. Weren't they like a big deal?
Huge. And there was this intense rivalry between Sound Blaster and AdLib.
Oh yeah, that rings a bell.
And that competition pushed both companies to innovate like crazy.
So it's like the 486 created this ripple effect,
Yeah.
right? Like it wasn't just the tech itself getting better, but it pushed everything around it to evolve too.
Absolutely. And the book gets into how this affected game developers too, because you had the arrival of Windows 3.1.
Okay. I feel like a lot of our listeners probably weren't even born when Windows 3.1 came out. So why was that so significant?
This is when graphical user interfaces, or GUIs, started to become the norm.
Wise. What does that even mean?
It means instead of interacting with your computer through text commands, like typing in code to make things happen,
Yeah.
you had the mouse icons, windows, the visual way we use computers today.
So Windows 3.1 basically made computers way more user-friendly.
Yeah, exactly. And it opened up computers to a much wider audience. You didn't need to be a computer whiz to use one anymore.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But I bet it created a whole new set of challenges for developers.
Oh, totally. They had to rethink everything. Design software that made sense visually, figure out how to make it work with a mouse and with the 486's capability.
I can only imagine the headache.
It was a wild time.
Yeah.
And speaking of pushing the limits, the book also talks about the rise of overclocking.
Clocking. I feel like I've heard that term, but I don't really know what it means.
Basically, you're tricking your CPU into running faster than it's supposed to, like pushing your car engine beyond its limits to get more horsepower.
Sounds risky.
Oh, it was. But it was also super exciting, It was all about experimentation, pushing boundaries, seeing what was possible.
So these early adopters were basically tinkering with their 486s, trying to squeeze out every last bit of performance.
Yeah. They understood the hardware inside and out and weren't afraid to mess around with it.
That's so cool. It's like the early days of PC modding culture.
Yeah.
Right? Where people customized their machines and pushed them to the max.
Yeah, you could definitely see that connection. And then on top of all that, you had the transition from floppy disks to CD-ROMs.
Okay.
Yeah.
I definitely remember those. But weren't floppy disks kind of cool in their own way? That satisfying click when you put one in the drive.
They had their charm, for sure, but they were super limited in storage space.
Right.
Imagine trying to fit a modern game with all its graphics and sound onto a bunch of floppy disks.
Yeah, good point.
CD-ROMs offered way more storage capacity, so suddenly developers could create much richer, more immersive experiences.
It was like opening up a whole new world for multimedia.
Totally. Games could now have higher quality audio, full motion video cutscenes, larger, more detailed game world.
I bet developers were going nuts with all the new possibilities.
Oh yeah. The book talks about the excitement, but also the challenges. Like loading times were a big issue with CD-ROMs. Developers had to figure out how to manage all that data.
And wasn't there a whole legal side to this too? Like CD-ROMs made it easier to copy software.
Right.
So piracy became a problem.
Wow, yeah, huge problem.
Yep.
The book touches on the early attempts to combat that, like copy protection schemes and CD key authentication.
It's crazy how many of the issues we're still dealing with today, like digital rights management and online piracy, have their roots in those early days of CD-ROMs.
It really shows how technological advancements often come with these unforeseen consequences. And then you can't forget about the Y2K bug.
Oh, yeah, the Y2K bug,
Yeah.
the potential computer meltdown that had everyone stocking up on canned goods and bottled water.
It seems almost silly now, but back then the fear was very real.
Right.
People were worried about everything from their bank accounts to the power grid crashing.
It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see if the digital clock would strike midnight and send us back to the Stone Age.
The book does a great job of capturing that sense of uncertainty and anxiety. It talks about how governments and businesses were scrambling to fix potential problems while everyday people were freaking out.
It's a stark reminder of how reliant we become on technology even back then, and how vulnerable we are to even seemingly small software glitches.
For sure. And what's interesting is that the Y2K bug also revealed the power of misinformation.
Like fake news and conspiracy theories.
Exactly. How quickly fear and panic can spread in the digital age.
I can only imagine what it was like back then with the internet still being relatively new.
It was a wild time. But hey, we survived it.
We did. Okay, so we've talked about the 486 itself, the rise of Windows 3.1, the Y2K bug. But what about online gaming? Because that was starting to take shape during this era too, right?
Yeah. Before broadband internet and massive online multiplayer games, we had BBS system.
BBS system.
Bulletin board system. Think of it as like a pre-internet online community. You dial in with your modem, connect to a BBS, and you could download files, chat with other users, even play some basic online games.
So it was like a digital hangout spot for people with shared interests.
Exactly. And for gamers, it was a way to connect with other enthusiasts, swap tips and tricks, and even compete against each other.
It's wild to think that something we take for granted today, online gaming, was such a novelty back then.
It was a true frontier, the early days of online multiplayer.
The book must be full of stories about those early online gaming experiences.
Oh, it is. The author talks about the excitement of connecting with someone across the country, the frustration of dealing with slow modem speeds and dropped connection, and the sense of camaraderie that developed within these online communities.
It's amazing to think that something as ubiquitous as online gaming had such humble beginnings.
It really highlights how far we've come and how those early pioneers were paving the way for everything we enjoy today.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already,
Yeah.
but there's one more thing we need to talk about. SimCity 2000.
Ah, yes, a classic.
I remember spending countless hours building virtual cities, trying to keep my citizens happy and my finances in check. It was more than just a game. It was like a virtual urban planning sandbox.
Exactly. And the book gets into how influential SimCity 2000 was, not just in the gaming world, but even beyond that.
Really?
Architects, educators, even some government officials used it as a tool to explore urban planning concepts.
Wow. So a game that started as entertainment actually had real-world application.
It speaks to the power of games to engage us, make us think strategically, and even teach us valuable lessons about complex systems.
Well, it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of what the 486 era had to offer.
We've laid the foundation. There's so much more to explore in terms of the games, the technology, and the cultural impact of this pivotal period in computing history.
This has been an incredible start to our deep dive.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to uncover as we journey deeper into the fascinating world of the 486 era. Back again for more 486 goodness. It's incredible how much innovation got crammed into those years.
It's like a fast-forward button got pressed on tech development, and we're still feeling the effects of it today.
Absolutely. You know, we got to talk about a company that really defined this era, id Software.
id Software. The name rings a bell.
They were the masterminds behind games like Wolfenstein 3D, Doomquake. Those are absolute game changers.
Okay, so for those of us who weren't glued to their PCs back then, give us the lowdown. What made id Software so special?
Their games weren't just fun to play, they were technological marvels. I mean, they pushed the limits of 3D graphics, introduced this fast-paced action, and created these worlds that were both terrifying and exhilarating to explore.
I've seen screenshots of those games, and even by today's standard, they have this certain cool factor to them. Like you can just feel the energy.
Yeah, totally. Imagine being a gamer back then and experiencing those games for the first time.
Like stepping into a whole new dimension.
Exactly. It was a revolution in gaming. The book has some awesome stories about the development of those games and the impact they had on the industry.
Like what?
Well, the author talks about how I Sold Software was obsessed with optimization. Like, they were squeezing every ounce of performance out of the 486, constantly experimenting, pushing the hardware to its limits.
Real trailblazers.
Yeah, and they weren't afraid to share their knowledge either. They actually released the source code for some of their games so other developers could learn from their techniques and contribute to the evolution of gaming.
So they were not only pushing the boundaries themselves, but they were empowering others to do the same.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And this era also saw the rise of online gaming communities, right?
Big time. We talked about BBS system, but the 486 era also saw the emergence of online services like AOL and CompuServe.
Yeah.
Millions of people were coming online, and these platforms became hubs for gamers to connect, chat, and play games together.
It's mind-blowing to think that something we take for granted today, online multiplayer gaming, was just starting to take shape back then.
It was a whole new world. The excitement of connecting with someone across the country or even across the world to play a game together.
I can only imagine the patience it must have taken to deal with dial-up connections and laggy gameplay.
Oh yeah, but the desire to connect and compete with other gamers was definitely there. And these early online communities were more than just places to play games. They were where friendships were formed, rivalries were born, and a shared passion for gaming brought people together.
It's like the early seeds of what we see today with these massive online gaming ecosystems.
Absolutely. Millions of players connected through platforms like Steam, Xbox Live, PlayStation Network. It all started somewhere, and those early communities were laying the groundwork.
And another thing that came along during this time was the evolution of web browsers.
Web browser. Now that sounds a bit dry compared to all this talk about groundbreaking games and online communities. Don't underestimate the impact of web browsers. Before they came along, accessing information online was a real pain. You had to rely on text-based interfaces and navigate through these complicated directory structures.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a bit of a headache.
So then you have the release of Mosaic in 1993, and that changes everything.
What was so special about Mosaic?
It was the first graphical web browser. You could view images, listen to audio, even watch videos online. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just text anymore. It was a multimedia experience.
That must have been mind-blowing back then.
Totally. It made the internet more accessible, more engaging, more fun, and it paved the way for other browsers like Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer, which would further refine the browsing experience and really make the internet mainstream.
It's incredible to think that something as essential as browsing the web was such a revolutionary concept back then. It just goes to show how quickly technology can evolve and how these seemingly small innovations can have a huge impact.
So true. Speaking of innovations, the 486 era also saw this big leap forward in 3D graphics.
We talked earlier about how games like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were groundbreaking for their 3D environment. Did something change that made those graphics even better?
Yeah, definitely. The development of graphics libraries like OpenGL and DirectX gave developers these super powerful tools to create realistic and immersive game worlds.
So games started looking even more amazing.
Way more amazing. Games like Quake, which came out in 1996, really showcased the power of these new technologies.
Yeah.
You had stunning 3D environments, fast-paced action, and groundbreaking multiplayer gameplay.
I heard hardcore gamers talk about Quake with a kind of reverence. What made it so special?
Quake was a technological masterpiece. It pushed the boundaries of what was visually possible on a PC. It had this gritty, realistic aesthetic, fast-paced action that demanded lightning-fast reflexes, and a multiplayer mode that set a new standard for online competitive gaming.
It sounds like it was a defining moment for first-person shooter games.
It was. And it had a lasting impact on the industry. It helped to popularize the genre, establish those core gameplay mechanics, and even inspired a whole generation of game developers. And you know what else?
Right.
The demand for more powerful graphics hardware to handle those complex 3D environments actually drove innovation in the GPU industry. It led to the creation of the high-performance graphics cards that we have today.
Wow. So the desire for better gaming experiences actually fueled technological advancement in other areas too. That's pretty remarkable.
It is. It reminds us that innovation often happens in unexpected ways, and that the pursuit of entertainment can actually drive progress in other fields. And another cool thing that happened during the 486 era was the emergence of new game genres.
So it wasn't just all about first-person shooters.
Nope. The late 90s saw the rise of real-time strategy RTS games with titles like Warcraft 2 and Command & Conquer. These games had complex gameplay, strategic depth, epic battle, and they really captured players' imagination.
I've played a few RTS games, and they can be pretty challenging. You have to manage resources, build bases, command armies, all at the same time.
It's a lot to juggle. RTS games require a mix of strategic thinking, quick reflexes, and the ability to adapt to constantly changing situations. And their popularity led to the creation of dedicated online gaming platforms like blizzardsbattle.net.
But players could connect and compete online.
Exactly. It was a shift away from those traditional LAN parties towards online gaming. And that trend would just keep accelerating as internet speeds increased and online platforms became more sophisticated.
I'm sensing another iconic game title coming our way.
You got it. We
Wow.
can't talk about the 486 era without mentioning Diablo.
Diablo, huh? I know the name, but haven't actually played it. What's the
Yeah.
big deal with this game?
Diablo was this groundbreaking action role-playing game that combined hack-and-slash gameplay with super addictive loot mechanics and this dark gothic atmosphere. You could pick different character classes, explore randomly generated dungeons, battle hordes of demonic enemies, and collect tons of weapons, armor, and magical items.
Sounds like it had all the right ingredients for a seriously addictive experience.
Oh yeah, it was a massive hit. And it spawned a sequel that became one of the most popular and influential games ever. And its success really helped to popularize the action RPG genre, which is still going strong today.
Wow. It's amazing to think how many of the games and genres we love today have their roots in this era of experimentation and innovation.
It really was a golden age for gaming. But as with any period of rapid change, it wasn't all sunshine and roses.
Okay, so let's talk about the downsides. What were some of the challenges that emerged during this time?
Well, as the internet became more widespread, we started to see its darker side. Things like computer viruses became a serious problem. Online scams and cyberbullying started to pop up, and people were still figuring out the whole online etiquette thing.
It's a good reminder that with every technological advancement comes a new set of challenges.
Absolutely. We had to adapt and learn as we went. And the 486 era taught us a lot about cybersecurity, online safety, responsible use of technology. Those lessons are more relevant than ever today as we navigate this increasingly complex digital world.
For sure. It sounds like the 486 era was a time of both amazing progress and important lessons learned.
Definitely a time of contradiction. But even with all the challenges, there was this sense of optimism and excitement about the future of technology. People were embracing the possibilities of the internet, and game developers were pushing boundaries, creating experiences that would shape the gaming industry for years to come.
There's something really inspiring about looking back at this era. It wasn't just about the technology, it was about this spirit of innovation and this belief that anything was possible.
Absolutely. The 486 era wasn't just a bunch of hardware and software. It was a mindset, a cultural phenomenon that helped shape the digital world we live in today.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the 486 era. It's wild to think we're talking about tech that's over 30 years old. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
It's true. The impact of those years is still being felt today. You know, we've been using this book, Revolutionizing the 486, as our guide, and it really drives home that point. Like, how much of what we take for granted now started back then.
Last time we were talking about some of the challenges that came with the rise of the internet, like viruses and online scams. It's a good reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
For sure. It was a learning curve for everyone, but it also shows how adaptable we are. We found solutions, developed new technologies, and figured out ways to make things safer.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit. We've talked about the 486, the games, the online world, all that stuff. But what about the big picture legacy of this era? Did it really change the world?
I think it's safe to say it did. One of the biggest impacts was the way it democratized technology. Before the PC became mainstream, computing was mostly limited to universities, big businesses, government institutions.
So the 486, along with Windows 3.1, made computers more accessible to everyday people.
Suddenly, anyone could own a powerful machine that could run sophisticated software, connect to the internet, play these amazing new games. It opened up a world of possibilities.
And I bet that had a ripple effect on creativity and innovation.
Right.
More people had access to these tools, and more people could experiment and come up with new ideas.
Absolutely. The book actually talks about how the 486 era led to a boom in independent game development. Small teams, often just a few passionate people, creating these groundbreaking games that challenge the status quo.
That's so cool. It wasn't about big budgets or corporate backing.
Yeah.
It was pure passion and a love for gaming.
Yeah, that DIY spirit is still a huge part of PC gaming today. Look at platforms like Steam and itch.io. They're full of incredible games from independent developers all over the world, and that all goes back to the 486 era.
That's the 486 planted the seed for this whole indie game dev movement that's still thriving today.
And it wasn't just about independent developers either. The 486 era also saw the birth or refinement of many of the core game genres that are still super popular today. First-person shooters, real-time strategy games, role-playing games, they all have roots in those early days.
It's crazy to think that genres that feel so established now were once brand new, being shaped and defined by those early pioneers.
The book actually does a great job of connecting those dots. It talks about how Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, and Quake not only popularized first-person shooter, but they also established a lot of the core mechanics-level design principles, even the visual style that we still see in FPS games today.
And what about those strategy games we were talking about earlier? I remember being totally obsessed with Command and Conquer.
Yeah, games like Command & Conquer and Warcraft 2 were huge. They laid the foundation for the real-time strategy genre. introduced concepts like base building, resource management, large-scale battles that are still essential parts of RTS games today.
It's wild to think that those early games were so influential. There are probably game developers working today who were inspired by playing those titles back in the 486 era.
Oh, for sure. And it's not just about specific games or genres, it's also about the sense of community that started to form around gaming during this time. We talked about BBS systems and early online services, but those were just the beginning.
Right. Now we have online multiplayer esports. It's also integrated into how we play and experience games.
But back then, it was revolutionary to connect with someone across the country, or even the world, and play a game together. Those early online communities were built on a shared passion for game, and that's something that's only grown stronger over the years.
So the 486 era didn't just shape how we play games, but also how we connect with each other through games.
Exactly. It was a time of experimentation and innovation, not just with the technology itself, but also with how we use technology to build relationships and communities. And those innovations are still shaping our lives today.
This has been an awesome journey through the 486 era.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts before we wrap things up?
I think the big takeaway is that the 486 era wasn't just about the tech. It was about a way of thinking, a spirit of innovation, and this belief that anything was possible. It was a time when people were pushing boundaries, experimenting with new ideas, and ultimately shaping the digital world we live in today.
Well said. And if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating era, we highly recommend checking out the book that inspired this deep dive, Revolutionizing the 486. Nostalgic Tales from the Dawn of Modern Gaming.
You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Playbook. It's a fantastic read that'll take you back to a time of incredible potential and technological wonder.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep playing, and keep that spirit of innovation alive.